So we don't read.
Good morning, everyone. I had breakfast this morning. I was up all night preparing. A little tired. Well, good morning and thanks for joining us for today's Maritime Policy Statement launch event. Is that what we're calling it, Luke? Maritime Policy Statement launch event.
That's it, sir.
That's it. All right. I'm Mike Stevens, the CEO of the Navy League. Don't believe me, I've got the name tag, so it has to be true. All right. And welcome to this important discussion on the future of America's maritime forces. And we are all very grateful today to have with us our moderator, Mr. Brian Clark of the Hudson Institute. Thanks, Brian, for being here. And our Maritime Policy Statement authors will be introduced by their world famous chair, Rear Admiral Sinclair St. Harris. And we'll still your thunders. These authors, and I can't overstate this, these authors worked tirelessly over a 2-year period, conducting interviews with active and retired sea service leaders, compiling data from government reports, analyzing emerging threats, assessing our nation's current capabilities. Then all this work culminated in the biannual release of our Maritime Policy Statement. It's a comprehensive blueprint of America's maritime security. And this document is provided to our new members of Congress every 2 years so they can better understand and address the needs of our sea services. I'd also like to thank, is anybody from GE here with us this morning? General Dynamics. Tom Callender's normally here with us, but I wanted to thank Tom, even though he's not here, General Dynamics, for their sponsorship and making this event possible. They've been terrific partners. It's now my honor to welcome famous Rear Admiral Sinclair Harris, the chairman of the Maritime Policy Committee. Sir, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank everybody for coming out today. And the hand of applause you're giving me really belongs to the gents at the table. Admiral John, acting U.S. Coast Guard, Mr. Don Caskin, SES, and fact more about SEALs than I ever going to remember, and 2 shipmates from previous assignments, Scott Sunt, Captain U.S. Navy, and the Honorable Colonel John McGinley, U.S. Marine Corps. These gentlemen and we've also brought on Harry Batson Thomas, Admiral Thomas, are the ones who draft this document, put it together, working with Luke Lorenz. Where's Luke at? Raise your hand. Let's hold this document together. Next slide, please. If you think about it, you know, you don't have to go very far in the media to see we're living in very complicated times. Very challenging times, get more challenging as the days go on. And so I will tell you that, you know, this document, which is 37 pages, it could have been 90. This document that was written, as soon as the ink dried on the document, it was out of date. Because the world, the complexity continues to grow and increase and be more challenging day in, day out. But what do we see that remains the same? The challenges in the maritime, the challenges in the littoral, the challenges to nations and governments that are addressed by the sea. And America is, and will always be, until the oceans dry up, a maritime power. We quoted many folks because I am not the original thinker. And a couple of them are here. I highlight them, they're in the document. And the author of one of them here, hey, Jerry, raise your hand. Captain Henry, and then I thought an excellent book on the primacy of sea power, where he says such focus on maritime domain by the United States may be the greatest guarantee of deterring war and ensuring prosperity for all. That is the bottom line of why the Navy League supports the Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and our U.S. flag merchant people. That prosperity and the best guarantee for our security come by our operations by and through the sea, maritime sea power. I mentioned just a couple of the things that really drove the construction of this document there on the top. There are many, many complexities, obviously, to our fight and our operations in peacetime war, whatever is in between, including climate change. You can be a believer in it or not a believer in it, doesn't matter. It's affecting our readiness, it's affecting our ability, it's affecting the populations that we serve, whether it be for humanitarian operations or anything else. Which is the second part. A couple of us have done some humanitarian operations in the past. The increasing threats, and I have the South China Sea and the Arctic sea lanes on this slide, but let's look at that peninsula of Europe. And we're so blessed to be working and having here with us Admiral Dean Fogo from the Center for Maritime Security. And this is one of the beautiful things about the Navy League is that it continues to evolve and grow and broaden its ability to support, educate, and advocate for the sea services through the organization. So he'll be challenging our document over the course of the next couple of years, and that's a good thing. And we hope you do the same as well. To say, hey, you addressed this, we didn't address that, or you need to talk about more of this other thing. We talk about American leadership and the international rule of law. I'm so happy that a couple of our international partners, raise your hand, gents, I see you there, because you're wearing different uniforms than us. You know who you are. We've never fought a war on our own, have we? And we're not going to ensure the peace without doing that in the future. The American sea power is essential to economic security, national security, and the maritime workforce. And we took a tack to talk about the workforce in this one, and I don't think anybody is surprised that the workforce is a challenge. We just had a Service Navy Association, and everybody, I swore I saw Admiral Delinas from Naval Sea Systems Command walk around with now hiring sign, okay, in front of them. Because it's hard to find the people, and it's hard to find qualified people, it's hard to retain people more and more every day. And it's affecting our national security. So we're going to talk about those things and highlight them. We try to highlight them somewhat in our document. Next slide. Real quick. Because I know that not as many people as I hope would read every page and every paragraph of the document. So we have a cartoon at the end where we highlight, okay, if nothing else, remember this.
I already jumped to the cartoon.
See, exactly. There you go. It's one of my NOVA council buddies here. So what are the top three priorities? And, we've done our studies and looked through it a couple of times. The Columbia submarine, and quite frankly, undersea warfare. If nothing else, we have to support not only that new submarine, the sustainment of that submarine, but also the sustainment of undersea warfare. That is a critical piece, from our review. Readiness, and you've heard the CNO talk about it, you've heard SecNav talk about it, you've heard the Marine Corps, the Commandant, the Coast Guard, all talk about the readiness across the fleet and increasing lethality. And this is, of course, an age-old challenge. Let's do it. And then the third top priority is the aggressive shipbuilding. Hey, where are my shipbuilders? Raise your hand. Any of them out here? How do you know you're out here somewhere? Okay, there we go. All right. They're not going to get the other side of the river up and running until they see a stable budget to build ships. And what do we need? We need to build and maintain ships. China has got no problem with it. They're outbuilding us. Okay, and quantity has a quality all its own. Next slide. For a Marine Corps, you probably won't be surprised. Top three priorities: the light and back to the shipbuilding, the light amphibious forces. It's not because I'm a Gator guy, I'll both Gator and Crudets, but having a number of these inexpensive or less expensive works capable of moving the Marine littoral regiment, the MLR, around and keep China guessing and reinforcing our partners is critically important. And again, deterring. The ability for long-range precision fires, ground-based anti-ship, and look, I'm as nervous as anybody about giving Marines long-range munitions. So you don't think about that. But it's pretty important to have that capability, especially in those choke points, to do what? Provide the sea control. And then the resilient C4 ISR, we don't have to look very far to see the cyber challenges that are out there. And the ability even to do mission command, even to do those operations independently, still require good, secure command, control, communications, and fusion. And finally, not finally, the next one, the Coast Guard. Next slide, please. My wife always tells me, you know, the Coast Guard needs more money. I said, hey, honey, but we're in the Navy. Yeah, the Coast Guard needs more money because they got 13 missions and they're all over the place and the world's wet and getting wetter. And, you know, whether it be rivers in the middle of the country or floods or saving people or knocking out drug traffickers, you know, they're all over the place. So continue to invest the transformation of the Coast Guard workforce. That's why we quoted Commandant Fagan again on the end of this document in the first slide. The world's going to look different. It already does. And thank God that we have elevated the role of women in our military and in our sea services. Otherwise, we would not be nearly as ready. We wouldn't be as effective. So that change, that diversity, we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We do it for a reason, because that's it that we're dealing with, and the need to have that talent in our workforce and in our leadership. Maintaining full funding for the Coast Guard's recapitalization. You know, we've heard the combat talk time and time again about how she is investing, and they've been on this road of investing in high investments, more recapitalization, more modernization. Critically important again for all those 13 different missions that the Coast Guard does, and that includes ones overseas. And then accelerating the investment in technology, very similar to the C4I resilience and need for the Marine Corps. Finally, last slide. And this is the group that does not get nearly enough attention, but it's critically important. And that is our sea lift capability. Now, we did this to ourselves, the United States. We allowed it to degrade over time. But when it comes to projecting American interests overseas, if the Army needs to get somewhere, it can't swim a tank. It can't fly everything. It's going to come by sea. Fuel, and we've all read about Red Hill. Where is the fuel going to come from for the Pacific? It's going to come through our merchant mariners in large part. We've got to get around this, and we believe that developing a new national maritime transportation strategy is critically important to that. We give it a vision so that industry and others can invest in it, so the American people can know what we need. And then similarly, expanding the U.S. merchant fleet and recruiting at the hiring. All these are highlights that you will find inside the Maritime Policy Statement. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and bring up Brian Clark, bring up my panel, and we'll sit here and take your questions.
Unless you'd like to be in the hot seat, so we got a lot of questions we'd like to ask them. All right, well, thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be here with you all today. And to talk to you gentlemen about the terrific work we did on the Maritime Policy Statement. So I'll start off just by getting at one of the things that the statement does right up front is talk about people. And normally when you write these things, as a lot of us have, people end up being at the end of the documents, like, yeah, people are something we gotta take care of and we gotta make sure that we keep them around. But people are now front and center when it comes to the policy statement and also some of the challenges that the maritime services are facing because it's a demanding employment environment. We also have challenges regarding the qualification of the people that are able to serve. So the statement brings people up right away and talks about the sea services team and the importance of the sea services team to being able to deliver capability down the road. And that's not just the operators, it's all the way back to the industrial base. So, to talk a little bit about that, so Scott, you in the Navy section, you talk a little bit about this. Some of the factors that are driving the challenging recruiting environment today and the challenges that all the services are having in actually making their quotas are out of our control, right? The economy is what it is, the unemployment rate is what it is. But there's other things that maybe are under our control. And what are some of the things that the sea services can do to try to improve their attractiveness to future recruits and retain those that we have that are thinking about leaving the service for better opportunities elsewhere?
Thanks, Ryan. The way I see it, and I've been reading across both the military and the civilian sector here, without a doubt, workforce development, workforce recruitment, retention is a big deal for everybody now. And I think it's going to be that way for at least the next 3 to 5 years. Really, people are really looking for, like as Aaron Harris said, the right people, right skill sets. And from the military and from the Navy's perspective, I think there's basically 3 areas that we really need, that we can do and that we can focus on. And these Gen Z and millennials here, they've grown up with war. They've grown up with a lot of tragedy. They've grown up during COVID. They've grown up with a lot of mistrust of leadership. And that's part of the way that they look at the world. They're not completely cynical, but they do have a great deal of sensitivity towards people not being truthful with them and not being thought of as they are deep thinkers and like that. And that's entirely wrong. And so one of the first areas I think the military and the Navy can do is we have to be able to make sure that the young people that are coming into our service are doing important work and interesting work and stuff that's valuable. They want to make an impact. And if it costs a lot of money to bring somebody into the service and retain them. And if you have them doing stupid jobs, they're not going to stay around. So you've got to do impactful work for these people. And they have to understand that we really, really want them because they have choices and they can walk in a heartbeat. Second area, I think, is you need to provide them avenues to grow professionally, educationally, and financially. They're very aware that it's a one-way street in life. And so depending on whether they make the Navy a career or not, that timeline is tracking constantly for them. So what do we have to offer them? And the service has a lot to offer young people, and it's a great place to start your life. It centers yourself on what you want to do, but also tells you what you don't want to do. I think that's really important for young people to be up on. The final area, I think, is we have to have outstanding leadership. And I'm talking about outstanding leadership with integrity, with honor, with who are constantly looking at their people as being the most important part of their mission. And I think to a certain extent, we still have too many leaders that get into positions that shouldn't be leaders. And it's just a fact of life. And when that happens on a ship or a squadron or something like that, it's pyramid effect. You have one person at the top and they are impacting 200 or 300 or 400 people. And then half of those people decide that's not for me. I'm not going to be working for somebody like that. And then they walk. And when you have a young person, if you spend $100,000 or $200,000 training, and he just does a single tour and he gets out because he doesn't want the big orders from certain leaders, that's on us. And that's something we have to do, and we can do something about. People don't get into those positions of authority without somebody knowing about it. A guy has 20, 30 years before he gets into a position of authority. Everybody knows who that person is within the organization. So we've got to do a better job of that.
Oh, thanks, Ed. So Admiral, can you, obviously Coast Guard's a little bit different recruiting environment, a little bit different job than what the Navy Marine Corps are running into. But it's also a bit more challenging. You also spent time, in the leadership of the Department of Homeland Security, and you saw what the recruiting and retention environment was for the civilian workforce as well. So what are some of the, challenges and opportunities there for the Coast Guard? And also, what's the role of families? Because obviously in those services, you have a family that's much more tightly integrated with a member who's maybe not going nearly as often as you would see maybe within a deeper.
Well, although the Coast Guard is under the Department of Homeland Security because of its law enforcement authorities, there are more similarities than not with the Coast Guard and the other maritime services. All the services deploy, all the services have the same challenge in recruiting, all the services have the same challenge with retention, and all the services have the same challenges with concerning families as well. The Coast Guard deploys to a lot of areas you may not be familiar with. The Mediterranean and the Black Sea. We've got 6 patrol boats in the Persian Gulf. We're in the South China Sea. We're in the Gulf of Guinea off of Africa, doing drug and migrant interdiction off of South America. So we do deploy quite a bit. And as I mentioned, that's very similar to what the Marine Corps and the Navy does as far as impacts on families. Another point is that the Coast Guard is competing for the same small pool of eligible and interested talent as the other services are. So it's not like Scott mentioned, not like the old days where it really was a conversation with a male wouldn't be did you serve or not, rather which service were you in. It's very common then, particularly during the age of the draft. That's not the case anymore. So for recruiting, the Coast Guard's got a couple of initiatives in place. Some of them have been around for a while. Some of them are fairly new. One is they've got a targeted marketing campaign. As Scott already mentioned, the younger generations think differently about problems and opportunities. Different messages resonate differently with them. Also, the Coast Guard's working to identify and reduce barriers for this group to try to cast the net wider and get more eligible young people interested. They are doing an idea that's been around for many, many years, but its effectiveness really is based on how we do it, and that is creating targeted incentives. So, for example, the Coast Guard has recently established a cyber specialty, and you're competing with Google and Amazon and all these others where people can make a lot more money. But the mission of the military services, the mission of the Coast Guard is really good and resonates with a lot of people. So targeted incentives is another way to get attention for recruiting. Another idea is increasing career flexibility. And frankly, I don't think any of the services have been that good at that. It's not a strong skill set that we have, but it's one that needs to be developed. So for example, a number of years ago, I was on the SecDef's Reserve Policy Board, and we were having a conversation particularly about cyber and how you might be able to get some of these young people cyber in, bring that talent up to the services. And about half the room was all for, let's try to lock them down. Let's have agreements with them in such a way that you can't leave it 4 years. You've got to stay 8, 12, find a way to kind of get some golden handcuffs. And the other half of the room was of a different mindset. And we were basically thinking, why wouldn't you make it easy for them to exit and come back? Why wouldn't you make it easy for a reservist or someone to go work for Google for a couple of years and then come back on active duty? Their skill set remains current, their network is strong, and that really was just too big a hill to climb at the time. But the Coast Guard is looking for ways to have more career flexibility going forward. Then another area with families, the Coast Guard often is not around a military base and doesn't enjoy all the infrastructure that comes with that, commissaries, hospitals, the safety of being on a base. We're often out in the community. So the Coast Guard is looking for ways to advocate for initiatives that will help Coast Guard people in high-cost areas, be able to afford housing in those areas since we don't have access often to base housing. And another initiative that's been underway for a number of years with the Coast Guard and continues is trying to make childcare more available. Again, we don't have a lot of the kinder care facilities that would be on a base. We don't have that available, so we've got to find other ways to make it more palatable for families to serve with their active duty member.
Thanks, Admiral. So John, Admiral Harris brought up at the beginning the challenges the merchant marine is facing, right? Recruiting, very typical for the merchant marine. The number of ships under U.S. flag continues to decline, which creates all kinds of challenges with sea lift. It also creates this potential for the dominant Chinese shipping industry to exert some kind of supply chain warfare, if you will, against the United States. So expanding that supply of merchant marines to support as well as expanding the number of U.S. flag ships seems like it's a priority that we should be pursuing. But how is the Maritime Services doing at recruiting and retaining merchant mariners? And also, there's other parts of the civilian workforce that are critical to the DoD and the Navy and the Marine Corps, in particular, the industrial base that supports shipbuilding as well as ship repair. So how are we doing it in those areas of recruiting civilian workers who don't necessarily have the same motivations and incentives that active duty military?
Well, with respect to recruitment from veterans, at least for the merchant marine, there has been a program that's been around for a few years called the Military to Mariners Program. And the services, which includes the Navy, Coast Guard, and the Army, and their Army Mariner, have set up programs to help transition, particularly the enlisted, to be able to go into the merchant marine. And the Coast Guard has established processes at the documentation center to be able to document their experience that helps them to get their licenses and certificates. So this is a program that's been on the books for a few years, but I really don't have a lot of statistics right now how successful it is, particularly in today's economy. But it is out there, and I think it is something that we should continue to promote because that skill set is out there in the military, and they could transition if they still want to have the profession they're going to see. Of course, some people don't leave the maritime services because they are required to do that, but others want to make a profession, and this is an opportunity that's out there. And a lot of websites from the Coast Guard, Maritime Administration, and others were about that. Retention is a different issue. Frankly, post-COVID, as with some other industries, a lot of people who had kept on going, even though they were boomers, had retired. And so there became a massive shortage of senior officers. And of course, they're hard to replace. But for getting youngsters into the programs, we, the Navy, have policies to help support the maritime academies in the maritime unlicensed facilities that be fully funded with the government program support. And we also have done some efforts with respect to supporting centers of maritime excellence. These would be programs where you would have, if it gets funded by Congress. Unfortunately, it's been authorized for $30 million, but there was no appropriations. And this would help have programs that would help get K through 12 informed about the maritime industries, and that would help get some youngsters to the industry at that time. So I can talk about shipbuilding, but I think that's about it.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that later, but obviously a key element of expanding the number of merchant mariners is expanding the number of ships that you have to operate. Hiring people that sit idle is probably the number attractive proposition.
The problem is that recently they haven't, can't even fill the ships that we have. This is something that's brand new to the maritime industry over post-COVID. Some ships are sailing short, some are actually having delayed sailings because they don't have some of the senior officers on board. So I think the maritime industry met about a week ago to specifically address those issues. Hopefully the supply and demand balance, but if we do grow, that will make the problem even harder.
Right. So again, coming to you now, there's a lot of factors affecting the recruiting environment right now. And I know you're working in some of those areas. I'd love to hear about that. And also as a lawyer and working in labor law right now, you're also seeing this from the end of what the civilian workforce is dealing with. So what do you see the factors are that are driving this kind of very challenging recruiting and retention environment?
There clearly are a lot of different factors. One of the things we just had to comment on, publish a opinion piece about a conversation about the value of military service. And part of the pushback has been the values in the military service. And we have American families that are not as convinced as they were in the past. I think that in some regard that has to do with the level of politics that has entered into military service that wasn't there during most of the time that we were on active duty. I just want to pull quickly a survey that was done out there when the Commandant and Secretary of Defense were out at the Reagan Library, and it was discussed was a survey that said military leadership becoming overly politicized. 34% a great deal, and 28% some. So that's about 2/3 saying yes, that is an issue. In the document we're publishing, one of the things that we advocate is that there be an effort to heal the breach that the effect of having a mandated COVID-19 jab really put a breach in our force. And it rocked us very hard in a way that I personally have never seen in my lifetime. I think that if we address that, go after that as an issue, and say, we're here to heal the breach, we want to figure out how to bring the Marines that have been dismissed back in. It is the fastest way I can put lethal combat power at the beck and call of the American people, is to bring back the 4,000 Marines and by extension, over 8,000 military service personnel. That's combat power. If we think about 3 regiments being a Marine division, around 6,000. If I can bring that and immediately provide you as quickly as the ink dries, more than a Marine division's worth of combat power, but put it against our needs. That is extraordinary. And you think about the cost. If we look at basic accession, which means just taking somebody who is currently in high school or college and trying to move them to the point that they now can wear the uniform, that's about a $9,000 process. And that means it pay recruiters, and you have other sunk costs in that initial training, oftentimes too. As soon as you move beyond that, you now see all the advanced training. And if we think about, if I have a fighter pilot, how long does it take to make an 18-year fighter pilot? 18 years. So if I get after that project today, in 2040, I can hand you the product that you're looking for, or I can bring it back. And I think that it's that important, it's that critical, and it's that quick. And it certainly requires a conversation about where we are and how we got there. And maybe not everybody will be excited about coming back, and we need to take and work through those issues. I think that can be done. But if we went after that, we would provide an immediate boost. Bigger than the actual number of people we might see come back is the effort that would take and move to the force that says, we've looked at this, they are Marines. We won't leave them in the street dying in Ramadi, and we won't leave them under these circumstances either. It means that this family looks after each other. You might remember being West wrote both the strongest tribe, meaning that what he had heard from the Iraqis was Marines were seen as the strongest tribe. That tribe needs to look after itself, and that would be a way to do it. It would also, I think, send a really positive recruiting message on where we are now as we come together post-COVID and how we unify.
Thanks, Ron. Manpower is a key contributor to readiness, and the policy statement talks about readiness being an important element of the future naval force. Readiness is often portrayed as a counter or a complement to force structure. and investment in the future capabilities of the force. And the Maritime Policy Statement tries to walk that balance. And I was wondering, Admiral Ackman, if you could maybe address, for the Coast Guard, you talked about the fact that the Coast Guard is very active right now, highly deployed overseas, while at the same time you're mounting the largest recapitalization effort in Coast Guard's history. How do you see the priorities need to be between readiness of that current force and investment in that future force? And how are they related? And where do you think the Coast Guard it should be driving that priority in its investment?
So readiness has been and remains one of the top priorities for the Commandant of the Coast Guard. And it's a constant challenge. It requires constant attention and focus, resources as well. The Coast Guard is approaching readiness on a number of different fronts. One we've already talked about, and that's manpower, getting the right people with the right skills in the right place. Another one is a big investment in technology. Coast Guard relies on a lot of data and networks to be able to get an edge in command decisions and be able to manage the force. And keeping up with technology can be very expensive when you've got these big networks. The challenge is you can't afford not to do it. You've got to make the effort to keep apace with technology improvements. Another one in particular regarding some of the Coast Guard's deployments. The Coast Guard has a number of classes of ships smaller than what the Navy has. And for those ships, usually we're able to maintain the readiness either by having smaller shipyards take care of the maintenance, or we cluster ships in a particular port, national security cutters, 3 or 4 of them grouped together so that we can get leverage the critical mass in training, depot maintenance, those kinds of things. For the larger ships, the national security cutters and the coming polar security cutters, those are a little bit different beasts. A lot of small shipyards can't handle that, particularly with an icebreaker where you have very specific skills that are needed with the shipyard. And in those cases, the Coast Guard is looking for ways to increase readiness by not going out on their own. For a small service, Coast Guard is smaller than the New York City Police Department. It's smaller than the Miami-Dade Teachers Union. So it's not a big service. It punches above its weight, but it can't go out on its own and duplicate shipyards and a lot of other efforts. One of the things the Coast Guard is looking at is leveraging existing DoD facilities and DoD logistics processes and whatnot to be able to use that when we have our larger units deploying to the South China Sea or to Europe or somewhere, one of the number of fleets.
So is the Coast Guard seeing that the new generation of ships, national security cutter replacing the high endurance cutters and the new OPVs that are coming out now, I guess, and then of course the fast response cutters, are they cheaper to maintain than their predecessors, or are they more expensive to maintain?
Well, the answer is maybe. On one hand, there are fewer hulls delivering the same capability as we have more hulls in the future. So if you get a single ship that has greater capabilities, you need fewer of them to accomplish the mission. Also, the manpower on the ship is going down as technology goes up. But the flip side of that coin is, as technology goes up, there's a cost and effort associated with maintaining that. So in the long run, there should be savings there, but it's really a trade-off between number of hulls, manpower, and then the investments needed in technology.
Right. And maybe a younger ship might be cheaper to maintain for a while.
Absolutely. So some of the Coast Guard ships are inland barges and cutters that do the aids to navigation. The average age of that fleet is 56 years, average age. The oldest, I think, is north of 75. Now, that's part of Deepwater Horizon to get those replaced with 3 different classes of ships. And it's very expensive to maintain a 70-year-old ship and keep it operational. So you're exactly right. A newer hull implies lower, at least near-term maintenance costs.
Yeah, good point. I'm Scott, I have a question for you about that. So the Navy is, faced with this challenge at, in greater scale. So balancing readiness versus force structure investments. And the Maritime Policy Statement addresses, what are some of the forestry priorities? I know there's mentioned a couple of those. How are those investments positioned though, versus investments in maintenance and training and kind of the integration infrastructure necessary for things like Project Overmatch to try to make the force better able to do combat when it gets downrange? How do you see the Navy needing to balance those investments? Do one need to be more important than the other, or, because at some point Congress has to make choices in terms of this.
Yeah, unfortunately, the easy answer is you gotta be able to do both. And there's always a finite amount of money, but at the same time, readiness, the CNO's made readiness is #1 priority right now. I think he's on the mark with that, because, if we need to get our ships to sea, they need to do real live exercises, they need to shoot, live exercises, they need to work on ASW, and submarine warfare. They need to work with coalition partners and allies. And they need to do meaningful exercises in that respect. And that all leads into readiness. You can't do a lot of readiness sitting forward. And it's just the way it is. You've got to get out there. You've got to actually act like a warship. You have to act like the flying squadron. You actually have to do those things. And the staffs have to be able to do that large group planning. Because it's a skill set that is very perishable. And so you've got to constantly do that. You just can't do it on the weekends, or you just can't do it for a couple of days every other month or something like that. It's a constant thing. In the past, in our history, naval gunnery didn't get good unless we did a lot of gunnery. And back to the 70s and the 60s, ASW didn't just come overnight. It's a skill set that is highly perishable, and you've got to get out there and you've got to do it. Because a submarine can run the whole day. In terms of readiness on your shores. It really can. And as in terms of ship maintenance and stuff like that, you can't operate your ships properly unless they're fixed. You've got to have your ships fully manned. You've got to have your ships in good operating condition. And that's something that's on the staffs. The staffs have to look ahead of this and say, look, if I'm going to send this guy to sea for 2 or 3 weeks to get some exercises done with coalition partners or with other ships, I got to give them the right tools to be able to do this stuff. I can't constantly be putting having them play with one arm tied behind their back. They've got to be involved with their ships the way they were designed to be operated. That doesn't mean to tooling around a little box or driving along at 15 knots in a straight line. You've got to be able to learn how to operate their ships properly.
Well, so that's a really good point. It brings out the fact the Navy's had a lot of experimentation efforts going on recently in integrated battle problem, large scale exercise, ramped up Northern Edge and participation and impact. So you got to invest in those. You invested in developing a new surface development squadron now in San Diego. So is the Navy doing enough to invest in the capabilities of these experimentation efforts to both develop new concepts and actually translate those into capabilities, or are these efforts still not fully, realized?
Well, I think right now we're in an interesting period here. We've had over 20 years of war. We're getting into what you would call the interwar period, the post-war period. This is traditionally the time of great experimentation, time of doing exercises, changing doctrines, trying out doctrines, trying out new research and development efforts. And you've really got to push the envelope here because you don't know when the next bad thing's going to happen. And you're going to be called the going harm's way. So while we do have a lot of these exercises, a lot of them are formulaic and pretty simplistic. And we're not really training the way we're really going to fight in the 21st century near-peer adversarial war. That war is going to be very fast. It's going to be very lethal. And it's hard to make that into an exercise, but we've got to be able to do better in that respect. We also need to make sure our COs, our commanding officers, and our staffs are given the ability to do free play, to think outside of the box. I mean, Admiral Arleigh Burke, he didn't get his nickname 31 Knot Burke for nothing. These guys, the people, the innovators, this is their time. And they need to be able to find out what they can do with their ships, with their staffs, with their squadrons, with their ships in ways that we may never have thought of how to use them. And if we just run these canned exercises all the time, we're not really pushing the envelope. I think we can do better.
And so at Colonel McGinley, that brings up, the Marine Corps has had this very dramatic shift with the new force design for 2030, conflict for basically trade advanced base operations, stand-in forces, and a lot of experimentation happening there. New Marine Patrol Regiment out of Okinawa was announced last week. So a lot of activity there. So how is the Marine Corps doing at investing in that, versus the more traditional investments that it makes in, doing our new deployments and also supporting those and the traditional amphibious operations. Are they putting enough effort into the new force design concepts and given the capabilities to empower them?
I think the short answer is yes. We're extremely aggressive about implementing force design 2030. The Commandant has a vision of a very different way to employ the Marine Corps and a lot of experimentation. They're also providing feedback through annual updates on how that plan looks and reshaping that plan. I think one of the things that really drives that warfighting theory is the threat that might come from China. And I'd bifurcate that. I would say not the Chinese people, because they suffer more than any of the rest of us. It's the Chinese Communist Party and what its ambitions might be. But to take and project power out of the Pacific requires a very different approach, both with strategy and tactics. In that, I think you might see a very early phase where you hold your surface warfare assets back because right now, offense with anti-ship missiles is better than defense. And in that early phase, you might call it Marines and submarines. Get out there and kill all those targets that might threaten our surface warfare assets and then flow them in when there's great dominance. In getting there, I think one of the things that we need to look at as the Chinese to take down satellites and affect our capacity for precision targeting and precision navigation. And one of the places that I think the Navy and the Marine Corps team together is having a more resilient architecture. And that looks very much at low Earth orbit assets and ties in with Space Force. And if we're going to put Marines out in very small groups, essentially alone and unafraid, ideally we'd like to be able to talk to them. I think we need to anticipate we won't be able to and give them task purpose orders and expect that they will operate autonomously. I think another part that we could weave in, one of the recommendations we make in this strategy document is the idea that we use smuggling techniques to resupply so that the Chinese do not have the same type of granularity with regard to where Marines are located as they're being resupplied and for both ammunition and all the rest of what they're dealing with, as well as the bandits. In that concept, you can see that will take a lot of experimentation. It does involve picking up blocks and maybe deploying surreptitiously that looks much more like special operations.
We'll talk a little bit more about that in talking about just sense. So John Caskin, I wanted to ask you about your readiness for the Navy for Maritime Services on an industrial base that's able to support that through ship repair, through depot maintenance, for aircraft, or depot maintenance for weapons. We just had another report come out from CSIS this week talking about the munitions industrial base and how it's not decided to support the military today. I don't think there's necessarily any surprises there for anybody, but the continued drumbeat, that the industrial base is not there really at the level necessary to support military operations at any level of intensity. So how are we doing with regard to the ship repair industrial base and the associated depots that kind of feed into that?
I mean, there's been a lot of reports, and I think it's highlighted at SNA, which I didn't attend, but I certainly saw the output of, which is their ship repair capacity is not capable of keeping up the workload. There's lots of reasons why that's the case, how it all got backed up. But the bottom line is that if you're going to maintain an industrial base, to be able to keep up with the demand, you need to have consistent requirements. And it has to be at a higher level than what we had maintained in the past, because we have, over the decades since the end of the Cold War, sacrifice resiliency for efficiency. Because we didn't think we were going to be in the situation we are at today. And in order to build back up that capacity, it's going to cost a lot of money and it's going to have to be consistent. Congress is not going to have, can't depend on congressional appropriations year to year to year. These shipyards and repair facilities need a long-term outlook because they're not going to make the capital investments necessary in order to grow without that type of security resources that are coming down the line. Unfortunately, that's not how government normally works. And so that's why we're in the situation we are today. But we used to have 20 major shipyards at the end of the Cold War. We're down to 7 or 8 now. The repair facilities are always sized to what is last year's contract. We just can't continue to work it through that process. We need a roadmap. And that's one of the things that we need to do. That's also for the merchant marine. We need to have that maritime transportation strategy that says, here are our long-term objectives. And it needs to come up with a strategy that says, here's the resources that we're going to need over time. And there are lots of different proposals in our maritime policy. But we need that transportation strategy coming out with, here is the roadmap, and come up with the legislation and that's necessary, and the resources associated with they can have. So all of the industrial base needs the same type of support with a roadmap or a vision and the resources to do it.
So to put you on the spot here, but so yeah, the statement doesn't necessarily get this level of detail, but do you think that the Navy needs to look at different contracting mechanisms for ship repair availabilities, or do we need different funding mechanisms from Congress and expanding this to operations and maintenance funds that are generally your funds?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same issue. We need to have, as John talked about, the Coast Guard's competing with the Navy with respect to part of the industrial base. You need a national shipbuilding strategy as part of the national transportation strategy or maritime strategy that says, okay, we have Coast Guard requirements, we have maritime administration requirements, we have NOAA requirements, we have commercial industry requirements. They need to be managed together. This is a critical industrial base capability capacity that has to be managed. It can't be done haphazardly. And so contracting mechanisms may be one part of the answer, but it needs to be looked at it. Here is what our objective is, what's the best way to do it, and then the resources.
Right, so you might need to synchronize actually what's happening between Coast Guard, Navy, civilian, Jones Act fleet.
NASC has a responsibility to do that in wartime. We need something to do it in peacetime to be able to help manage that industrial.
So let's talk a little bit before we go to questions from the audience about force structure. Force structure is generally the thing to be off with, and I thought we should talk a little bit about it here at the end because a lot of the recommendations are pretty straightforward, but obviously some are going to be difficult to take action on, especially in a Congress that's going to be split between the parties this year. So the Admiral Acton, the Coast Guard's in the sort of a later part of its the original water recapitalization effort that had started almost 20 years ago at this point, I guess. There's some concerns about the OPC class and its, the ability of the shipyards to build that. It's moved from shipyard to another shipyard. There's also maybe some concerns about polar security cover and getting finished at BT Halter. But there's opportunities maybe to continue building some of the existing ships like national security cover, fast response cover, maybe go beyond the requirement. So what do you see what should the Congress be looking at as they think about force structure investments for the Coast Guard? And you've got, these opportunities to maybe continue building existing classes while new classes are maybe altered.
So you may recall, as you mentioned, Brian, that quite a number of years ago, 20 or so years ago, when Coast Guard launched their deep water program, the idea was to recapitalize all the major ship classes because they were very old and not as efficient. And early on, the Coast Guard didn't have the skills needed to oversee a program of that magnitude. So they relied on the Navy's contracting help to be able to do that. So early on in deep water, there were a number of bumps that had to be worked out, and those were worked out, and a number of the classes were delivered, able to deliver holds that were very effective and very efficient. So the national security covers, the fast response covers, those are on track and going well. In fact, Congress has given the Coast Guard a number of holds above the program of record, the national security cover. Those are very capable platforms. Those are the ones that we send to the Med, the Black Sea, South China Sea. They're very capable, but they're very expensive. And although it's nice to have a few more holes with those capabilities, the Coast Guard was and is concerned that they get the funding for the logistics tail that needs to come with that. Don't just give us the hole and then you've got to take the operational funding out of high. So and with the fast response cover, the FRCs, those are the ones we have now over in the Persian Gulf, very capable platforms as well. But Deepwater Horizon was designed as a intentional portfolio. And each element of the portfolio has a certain set of capabilities, and the number of holes provide you a certain capacity. And although OPCs, there have been some bumps in the road with OPCs, the fact of the matter is the fewer national security cover holes, even if you give us a few more of those large holes, they're not going to be able to provide the coverage that's needed. You just don't have the numbers that are needed. And if you provide more fast response covers, much smaller, about 180 feet, for their mission, they're not going to have the sea legs that you need with an OPC. So I think the first option would be to get the OPC program, Offshore Patrol Cutter program, back on track and producing smoothly to finish up that line item, rather than try to augment it with more expensive NSC hulls or the smaller, a little bit less capable FRC hulls.
Sense. Colonel McGinley, we talked about the Marine Corps and its Force Design 2030 and the experimentation going into that. We're kind of now getting to the part of the implementation, if you will, where hard choices are going to have to get actually put into action. So it's one thing to say, I'm going to reduce the number of traditional rubber we're going to have, or the number of armor, kind of armor we're going to have. That's how we can actually start moving the force and buying things different. Do you see the Marine Corps being able to make that transition through this next Congress and the appropriation bill that comes from 2024?
I think there will. Obviously, there was a lot of concern when we got rid of battle tanks. That has happened. Fortunately, that talent was recaptured in large part by the Army. But if you look at a lighter, more agile force, the idea there for the Commandant was that using that weapon system is just too heavy for what I need in terms of the force, and it can be supplied within the concept of joint force. But there has been some rethinking going on, because originally there was a grant scheme for more downsizing in certain types of rotor wing too. That's changed. So I think that as we learn more, as we revisit the assumptions that were originally you'll see that they keep modifying it. And I do expect to have good support from Congress for that. And I think probably well informed as a result of some of the concepts.
So the light amphibious warship is something that Admiral Harris mentioned at the beginning. It's one of the top priorities for the Marine Corps. We had a recent reporting saying that maybe the Navy and the DoD are going to pause the program or delay that program. Do you think that's that makes sense? And then two, are there alternative platforms Marines could use to do that same kind of littoral support function, either in the meantime or as an alternative to the light amphibious warships?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the things that we need to look at is, can we take and insert Marines covertly so that they come in a non-traditional modes of transport. I went to one of my combat tours on United Airlines. A little tough getting weapons checked in, but after that, everything worked out well. So, it tells you that we know how to do that. Very various different locations across the Pacific that didn't get there by usual shipping. And then the question is, how do you move the rest of their supplies in? Maybe that looks like DHL, but I think we need to have not only some experimentation in that area, but also use interagency process, because various different three-letter agencies have a lot of ability in this area. And I think that with the right amount of interagency cooperation, we might really build what our knowledge base is.
There's got some, so the Navy has benefited over the last couple of years in terms of force structure, from additional investment from Congress, adding more of existing classes of ships and more DDGs, adding in some cases amphibs, adding submarines, which maybe cannot be necessarily built any faster, but certainly put the investment there, so the demand signal is consistent. Do you think in this next cycle, Congress should look at doing that same kind of adding on to the existing classes of ships, or should Congress be putting more investment into some of the new platforms, so new unmanned platforms that are going to be needed to augment those manned ships? Where should they be putting more priorities if they've got extra money they would like to spend?
Well, honestly, I think we gotta be able to do both, because you gotta maintain the hot production lines. That's important because the well-run shipyards need to be level loaded. You have a very highly trained, skilled workforce that needs to have work to do all the time. And if you don't have ships in the shipyard, they're gonna let the workers go. That's not a good thing. At the same time, I think you gotta be able to constantly be planning and researching and designing new ships for the future. And so you've got to do that part too. And it takes a long time to bring a ship into fruition. That's another downside though, is it takes too long for a ship once it starts to get built. 5 to 7 years is entirely too long to build a ship these days. I know the ships are complex and everything like that, but you got to be able to figure out more economies to be able to build the ships faster. I think you need more collaboration between the designers, the warfighters, and the budgeteers. You can't have these guys in 3 exquisite silos. They've all got to be working together to find out what's the realm of the possible, and then they got to move out smartly and do that. And building ships that are already on the ways and already been designed, that's a good thing, because you get economies of scale by doing that. Our DDGs are some of the finest in the world, and why not build more of those? Those are outstanding ships. So we know how to build them, we know how to build them right. So there's no reason to shut down that capability and then do something entirely new, because there's a lot of risk when you do that. Same time, the unmanned stuff is coming, it's going to be necessary. And I think this is where getting to John was talking about is, well, we have some smaller shipyards to do some of this unmanned stuff. There are opportunities out there. It's a great time for researchers and designers and warfighters to get together and make this happen.
Yeah, good point about the smaller shipyards. And so one other question on that is, we just talked about amphibious warship, maybe getting delayed or paused or just eliminated. What about the LPD? So currently building LPDs down in Pascagoula. The Navy seems like it's not interested in building any more of the LP-17 class, at least for a while. That production line is going to go fallow. So how should we be thinking about taking advantage of using that production capacity, building more LPDs or building something different, or otherwise it's going to be lost, as you said?
Yeah, I think you got to relook at that a little bit. I think we always need an amphibious piece in our Navy. Amphibious ships, you get a lot of use out of an amphibious ship. They have lower draft, you can get in a lot more port facilities around the world. They can be used for a lot of things along the spectrum of maritime engagement. And they're great ships and great platforms to use in a multitude of operations, not just wartime operations, but peacetime operations. Let's face it, I was on the destroyer and it did 25 years of service, a great service. It was in combat for 2 weeks. That's all they did. And so let's be real about this. You get an amphibious ship, you can use it everywhere. And you can use it in operations. Announcement for my gators.
And even the older ones are in great shape, just like. So.
USS Comstock, oldest amphibious warship on the West Coast, and still in great shape.
That's right, exactly, absolutely. So John, well, I wanted, on terms of the, force structure, the sea lift fleet, as we said, not in great shape. So the reserve force, managed by MARAD, the average age is 40+ years. We're slowly recapitalizing that. Not necessarily with new ships, with all new ships in some cases. And then the US flag fleet, as we said, has been shrinking consistently over the last several decades. And is now about 80 ships, 86 ships. What do we need to do to be able to provide that sea level capacity? That's not just needed for the big one, the big war, but it's needed for a lot of kind of day-to-day operations as well. And also to sort of our backup in case we do have problems with regard to using Chinese flag shipping, for example. Yeah, how do we go about standards?
Well, the maritime policy has a lot of recommendations, but the issue is how many ships do we need for what? And it really hasn't been really looked at for not just the military requirement, which is what U.S. Transcom and the Joint Staff developed in mobility study. But what we need for the defense industrial base as well as the rest of the economy. We have seen that we don't have the ability to charter the ships that we thought we could charter in the old days when we were going to plan for it. If we wanted to go fight a war, where were we going to get our fuel from? And okay, we'll charter tankers off the market. Well, when you take a look at a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, you have to take a look at how you're going to be able to do it with your own assets and that with your allies. But how many allies do we have, let's say, for tankers for moving fuel in the Pacific? Well, we haven't seen output from the U.S. Transportation Command on what that military requirement is. The best thing we have is a study that we've done at CSBA, it says sustaining the fleet resilient maritime logistics, and it shows how many additional transport ships and sea lift vessels, tankers, are at the console with it. Well, until that is actually numerically quantified, and U.S. Transcom has not produced an unclassified number of how many tankers we need. When we were looking at ground wars, conventional ground wars in Korea, which is going to work, or going to Iraq, we needed 86 tankers. Right now, we have a program of a 10 tanker security program of 10 ships. We probably need 40 or 50. If we had those 40, 50 ships, that would provide enough crews to be able to crew the current ready reserve force. But is the ready reserve force the right mix and right readiness? Was for ground wars in Iraq. Do we need these 50 ships, 45 ro-ros in 5-day readiness? Why do we recapitalize what we have? And that doesn't probably make any sense until we have this maritime transportation strategy developed with new numbers. The last time it was done for economic military security requirements was at the end of the Cold War in the Commission on Merchant Defense in 1989. That's really what this maritime transportation strategy, which the Navy League drafted legislation that was passed by the House and they got conference, and this is section 35.2 of the NDAA, which is actually says we're going to have a FFRDC start developing this effort, but it's going to need those numbers. But I don't believe we should recapitalize the RRF. We ought to have a larger merchant marine. Most of the ships in the RRF are commercial ships. They only need a half a dozen special mission ships like crane ships and aviation support ships that need being reserve status. All of the rest of the ships should be in active service, and there could be through marine highways, U.S. flag ships, it's expanding MSP, TSP. There's lots of different options, but we shouldn't be spending money buying new ships where the money goes to China to buy the replacement ones. We ought to be having ships, more ships, and we used to do it. I mean, I took a look at a Maritime Administration annual report in 1966. They were building under the CDS program 16 ships that year, and they were subsidizing over 100. I mean, we have done it in the past, and we can do it. We just have to have a strategy and, of course, the resource to do it, which is going to be a challenge.
Sure. So let's turn to some questions from the audience. Do we have a microphone, or will people just yell this time? Okay, then we'll just yell. Okay, Captain Retired Jerry Hendricks, you're the first question.
So I have to say, this is fantastic document. Just looking it over this morning. My
my compliments. I have to do a fact check with somebody that's publishing an essay. And I'm gonna just be able to point at this as the greatest, consolidation of a lot of data that I'm working with. I just want to highlight these sections here dealing with the maritime transportation system and US flag. The recommendations that you have here, the depth of them is really fantastic. Your recommendation on expanding the Jones Act, et cetera. I think the thing that struck me though, and this is a question, is we seem to be focused on sort of building ships for the use of the government. We ought to, I think that there's a subtle change in the language, which is we ought to be building ships because we make money. We make money building them. We make money having our goods travel on them to and from foreign ports. This is additive to our economy. It's not just for the benefit of that. So that was the one thing in sort of tone that I wanted to do on this. And then I wanted to ask more specifically is there a role for an industrial policy where something like the Office of Defense Management that used to exist in the Eisenhower administration, so on, to actually manage our defense industrial base and our civilian industrial base? Do we need that sort of level of capitalization focus on managing? We talk about shipyards and so on. Should we be looking for the government to have that role and looking at where we need to make these types of investments?
Yes. During the Cold War, we did do this to pretty much a great extent. The Industrial College of the Armed Forces is where industry and military and government agencies, all the government, went together to determine how we were going to mobilize the economy when we were going to fight the Soviets. We had a mobilization plan. It was developed. So as part of that overall effort, we would determine, just like the CHIPS Act determined, okay, this is a segment of our industry that we have to bring in-house, and because it's part of critical to our economy. Our economic security issues has been outsourced. I mean, we did think that we really needed to have these essential capabilities. Well, what are those essential capabilities? What are the priorities? What strategic materials do we need? All of this was just part of the culture. I mean, when I was doing war planning, when I first got into the Pentagon, there was a P-Day in the war plan, which is when our war reserve stocks, our munitions, which we had 1 week's worth, according to the CSIS war gauge, on certain PGMs would be running out in a week. The industrial base was supposed to be in place, building up to replace, to be able to sustain our consumption after P-Day. Who's ever heard of that? We got rid of all of that after the Cold War. And yes, I think I don't know what we had with respect to government management, but, for wartime purposes, as I said, we had CAOC or something of that sort. And NAVC was managing all of the shipbuilding industrial base for a wartime purpose. Do we need it for peacetime? Yes. But again, I don't know exactly the mechanism. But again, unless you start developing a strategy, whether it's a maritime strategy, an economic strategy, then we can get a roadmap to rebuild what we had. I think it's going to be, whether it's possible or not, the timeframe is necessary, it's certainly questionable, but I think we got to get started.
I'll also make a shameless plug here for an effort that the Hudson Institute and the Center for Maritime Strategy, led by Kate and Jane Fogo, is mounting to bring awareness to this issue of the U.S. flag shipping industry and the lack of U.S. flagships to be able to support both our national interests as well as future military operations. So I want to say something.
Yeah, just a foot stomp a little bit there on what Doug was saying here. Campaign warfare ultimately is about, logistics and sustainment. You're going to do it for any length of time. The logistics and sustainment has to be there in place. You can't shoot up all your ordnance in 2 weeks and then the defense industrial base says, hey, it's going to take 2 years to build back up our weapon stock. It doesn't work like that. And we can't have that happen because if you have a strategic pause in the modern warfare, you're done. And so this logistic and sustainment piece is not just on the military side of stuff. It has to be very carefully worked together and coordinated with the defense industrial base. And they have to be on board with what we're trying to do. And they have to be brought into the Pentagon and sat down at the table and say, here's what our plan is. Can you support that plan? And then they have to have that exchange and say, well, yes, no, and whatever. But you don't have the logistics and sustainment piece down, and somebody takes out your oiler in the first week, you're out of Schwitz here in about 2 weeks. Don't have any oil. So, as John said, it's critical. You can't get away from it.
Yes, that's it.
Since Brad brought it up, let me put stop on this. And, when I started here over a year ago, it was, Admiral John Harvey challenged us to do something different. Don't be the traditional raw destroyers, frigates, aircraft carriers. And so we started to partner with John, his team on commercial maritime, Sarah, for transportation. Since that time, I've been down to Norfolk, I've participated in the Bob side of the Gulf Air Sea Lift Command. And I'll tell you, John, the numbers from Admiral Wetlock are higher than your numbers for oilers. Even if you're classified level, they're just not there. Can't fight a war without getting beans and bullets of the troops. And Scott Swift and I, Swift talking about this, that, you know, the critical node, the Achilles heel of the Chinese Navy, it's not the Chinese frigates and their 3 craft carriers, it's the logistics force at sea. And we're gonna have to do what Mahan said, and that's very course, safe. Chinese commercial shipping is saving war materials to their part. Now that is a very tough question, but if you look at the reverse and you do it to us, we're fragile. We're even more fragile. That period's up. We talked to Wetlocker, we talked to Amy Phillips over at MARAD. She's down on the 1st floor of the Department of Transportation. Secretary Buttigieg is on the 7th floor. And what's he doing? Southwest Airlines and trains shutting down at the holidays. There's no need with that. And so we've got to elevate that interest. That's what this document does. So kudos, gentlemen, a lot of work to do. And really do need that maritime policy strategy for transportation. One of the things John brought up, I never did this. John, you can correct me on the details, is that MARAD, under hypothetically, technically speaking, at the time of the war, should be sitting at the table with Northeast. Imagine that. He's a retired 2-star officer. Busby's a retired 2-star officer. If we really want to get something done, we've got to take the covenant measures. That's one idea that we can throw out. That would be shocking to the one in the Senate, I'm sure. But, you know, it underscores the importance of commercial maritime, which Brian and I are working on, our 2 fellows, Robinson.
Yeah, it opens up a new avenue of supply chain warfare potential. Next question, yes, please state your affiliation and your.
Yes, my name is Jerome Davis. I retired from the Maritime Administration. I used to actually run the Office of Sea Lift Support for the Maritime Security Program and voluntary retainment written programs. Awesome. I have a question that maybe for Mr. Caskin, because I think he hit on a lot of good points. In your recommendations on the maritime, one of the questions that I was concerned about was when I was at Maritime Administration, we were always looking for measures to try to recapitalize the RRF. The RRF is not going to play anytime soon, but we know we're going to have to recapitalize that. So one of the proposals that we had tried to submit inside legislation was to take maritime security ships, maritime security program ships that were aging out, and maybe trying to buy those ships and then use those ships to recapitalize the RRF. And that would give actually the commercial shipbuilding industry some work. So I was wondering why that wasn't in your recommendation or maybe you looking at it didn't consider it to be valid, but I was just wondering where did that stand? Where does it stand?
To make it quick, there is legislative authority to do that. So, I mean, and MARAD did do that for 2 ships already. The problem was is that the prices, they had $25 million. They bought 25-year-old ships with $25 million. And so you're recapitalizing very old ships with old ships. And the newer ships are not as well built as the older ones. But my primary premise here is we shouldn't even be putting any of those ships in the RRF at all. Why should we have ships that were commercially viable put into reserve status? And the answer was, well, we need them in 5 days. How many do we need? What for? Do we really need 40 rowboats to move the Army to Europe? I mean, so the requirement is really the issue. before we start recalculating commercial ships, why don't we look at other ways of having active ships? The Marine Highway proposal, which we worked with the Maritime Administration, which would have had dual-use vessels moving trailers up and down along the interstates, all the east and west coast, I-595, would cost a lot less than to buy old ships. And frankly, the Navy's programmed $100 million to buy and convert ships in the budgets for the next couple of years. That's a lot of money for a used ship, when you could put that money to figure out how to incentivize these commercial ships to operate along our coast if we need them in a 5-day readiness. And they would be US built and could work for the US shipyards. So I think there are better alternatives. I think the RF personally, and I always thought it was a failure of maritime policy for a large merchant fleet. We need to rebuild the merchant marine instead of recapitalizing the RF.
But I would agree with you on that. I did want to point out that one of the problems that we have in MTP was the fact that Transcon was always asking for roads. And that was always a big issue. But considering the commercial road was taken. The other thing is, it was a big issue for us. Okay. I don't know how we resolve it.
Trailer ships like the going to Alaska is the way to do it. We need those along the east and west coast.
We have time for one more question. Sir.
So Don Klein, America, former P3 guy in Africa, combat logistics specialist. We talked a lot at the front end about prospective shifts in the aircraft, but what happens if they get into a shooting war and they take a lot of battle damage? I'll use this example, Hornet after battle midway, right? It's turned around the full harbor for 4 days. What kind of capacity you have to do that in Westpac in a hurry, given the small size of the fleet today? Or are we just going to throw our hands up and say, hey, we expect everything to be sunk and there's nothing we can do about it? I mean, we've lost floating dry docks and long, other capacity. A huge issue going to a lot of attention.
It's just how you want to feel that first.
Yeah, from a active perspective, you fight through. I mean, you have to figure, you have to know your ship really, really well. And we used to exercise that with our ships, with the total ships, fighting building and stuff like that. You gotta be able to fight with your ship part. That means you gotta go back into the fight, you gotta keep fighting and shooting until there's nothing left in your storage. They have to do a pullback, slow pullback, while the other forces come to the fore. But in the meantime, you gotta keep figuring out how you get around. I used to tell my people when I was in camp, don't tell me the thing is broken, tell me what I can still do with it. You know, if my gun is frozen in one position, I can still turn the ship around and keep shooting. Because if I have to do that, that's what I gotta do. And comes into that, the issue of innovation in warfare. People do a lot of things under pressure that they would never do if you do it in exercise. And we got to figure those kind of things out from a tactical perspective. On the repair side, again, you have to be able to let that innovation at the workforce, at the deck fleets, figure that out. They know how to do this. I mean, back in the day, we had chiefs and NCOs who could make things work so that you could get underway. They know how to do these things if you give them a real.
So currently, okay.
I think that I respectfully disagree with you. There's not a lot of infrastructure. There's no spare tenders and more airships. How are we going to replenish? I'm not talking about fuel, but how are you going to load a Mark 41 VLS forward? I see dabbling experimentation, but there's nothing that we're doing as a part of the concrete muscle memory. Shipboard deck plates don't really go so far. There's going to be time where we can cut steel and lift out any components, and I just don't see the investment in infrastructure there right now. And I think that's probably really indication.
Well, and so currently, I was going to ask you, so the rates are going to be looking to operate in these very austere environments with very low, small footprint forces. How do they intend to try to sustain themselves either with regard to repair or with regard to logistics?
I think with logistics, it has to be conventional. And I think you probably saw some of the follow-on articles with experimentation now using a joint strike fighter vertically. So you get a parking lot, make sure it's in good shape with a fog walk, and then operate our attack air out of what otherwise would not be normal airbase. And use other types of assets like B-22s and 3Ps. Now, Kingstown is the K, bringing forward arming and refueling the aviation sense. So it looks much more austere, but with great respect for anti-ship missiles.
Right, well, and you just got to accept the request that the pastor got shot at.
That's right. It's part of the standard enforcement.
So, well, with that, we're about out of time, so I want to give a hand to our panelists and authors, so. I'm going to turn it over to.
Please, what an expert moderator. Thank you, Brian. Apart. And my thanks to the writers really of the document. I just had to say yes, no, maybe, okay, what about this? These guys, the heavy lifting, and to Admiral Kerry Thomas, U.S. Coast Guard, Mr. Pete Leota, and Lorenz and the chief seats, for all their support. And thank you, Dave Riley, and to Big Pond Stevens for the support of the staff of the Navy League of the United States, for the great work and great support they've given it to us. All right, get your pens out or get your computers out ready to take notes and write this down. There are 5 things that you can do. If you believe half of what we're selling here, if you believe half of what we're saying inside here is important, there are 5 things that you can do to make a difference. Number 1, guess what it is? Join the Navy League. We've got over 30,000 members, I believe, last count, and the number needs to keep going. And it's important because in our mission to support, to educate, and to advocate, notice that spells C, the maritime forces, it takes all of our voices here. So please consider joining the Navy League, especially if you're under 40, raise your hand. Especially y'all and your friends. Okay, we need to have these younger voices. Number 2, Andy Sandup. He's the executive president for the Sea Cadets of the United States. And the Sea Cadets, that's our people. Along with the Young Marines, it's organizations like that that are critically important. And we need even us older hands to provide support for our Sea Cadets. All right. Maybe it's once a month, maybe it's once a week, whatever you can do. Okay. And encourage your kids to consider it. It's a great and important program. Number 3, please read this document. Challenge us, send your Snyder Marks comments. Hey, what about this? Great comments over here from my P3 friend here. Please, because to make this a living document, it takes all of us. Tied to that, number 4, the Center for Maritime Strategy. So we write this document. I told you as soon as the ink was dry, it was already passed and open. It was already obsolete. There were things that were missing in it. How do you keep that conversation going? The Center for Maritime Strategy keeps that conversation going with excellent podcasts. My wife watches them more than I do and gets me all the editorial on it. But it's that dialogue that continues to drive home the mission. And then number 5, tell your story. How many of y'all served in the military, whether you were in uniform or as a government civilian? Raise your hand. Tell your story. Tell your story to the young. Tell your story to the old. Tell your story to the weak. Tell your story to the bold. Tell your story so that people understand the value of service, the importance of our sea services, and what they can do, whether they be in uniform or not. I'm going to turn it over here to our Executive Vice President for Business Operations, Ms. Brian Donaldson, but thank you.
On behalf of my colleagues at the Navy League and our boss, Mike Stevens, we'd like to say a thank you to our speakers and our moderator for this truly informative discussion. And thanks again to our sponsor, General Dynamics. Give them a round of applause. Everyone's information, Sears Space 2023 will be held on April 3 through 5 at the Gaylord Hotel and Conference Center at the National Harbor in Maryland. We look forward to seeing you there and networking with you there. Please enjoy the rest of your day.
Checking out.